In this episode, and I think it's going to be a good one, I'll be moulding up this casting of John Friedlander's original Hieronymus mask, as very kindly I've been given permission to replicate it. To do that, I'll be moulding it in Tin-Cure silicone rubber from DWR Plastics, backed with a rigid support shell made from Plastic Paste 2, which is a product from Smooth-On that I'll be trying out for the first time. The final copies will be cast out in a 2-part polyurethane resin infused with brass powder, just because I think it will look nice with that realistic metal finish. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves just yet, as I still need to mould the thing first. This little lot represents a trouser worrying £400 worth of materials needed to get this project going, and for this instalment I'll be concentrating on just the moulding side of things, so let's see how I get on. Before I can even think about the silicone, let alone the casting resin for that matter, I first have to prepare the mask for the work ahead of me. To do that, I'm using Sculptix Soft, a sulfur-free clay by Reynolds Advanced Materials. I start by cutting it up into thin strips and press it firmly onto the inside of the mask, making sure to follow the contours accurately. This has two purposes. Firstly, it softens the transition between the clay and the mask, which makes for a clean and tidy looking tool. Secondly, and most importantly of all, doing this will prevent the wastage of valuable material by sealing the edges of the casting and the clay together. Silicone will always find even the smallest of pinholes to escape through, and in this case it could seep back into the void under the mask once it's seated onto its backing board, effectively entombing it in a solid block of rubber. That obviously would render the entire mould unusable, so it's always best to ensure that everything is properly secured, but I'll get to that quite shortly. Notice that I'm adding a second layer of clay here, set just back ever so slightly from the first. This will form a built-in retaining lip that'll stop resin from accidentally sloshing out during the casting phase. It's just another material-saving measure. Using a sculpting tool, I carefully blend all the joins around the entire clay up and then soften everything with a brush dipped in white spirit. A final whip around with a thumb or a finger just helps to polish everything off to a smooth finish. I'm all for having clean and tidy moulds, me. I just like things to be presentable, especially my own work. Next up, I'm using a piece of acrylic sheet as the backing board that I mentioned earlier. Once the mask is centered correctly within it, I push it down firmly for good adhesion. Thin clay worms are then rolled out and pressed into the joint to fully seal everything into place. A chisel-headed silicone brush is a fantastic tool for blending out clay and tidying up all the edges, so if you don't have one, I highly recommend them. Just like before, white spirit on the brush provides a smoothing finish for that polished look. You don't have to do this, but it does look nicer this way. The final clay work at this point is the laying down of a damming wall that'll catch all the silicone later on. A loathe waste, and this'll just help to prevent that. A quick but thorough sealing with spray wax helps to release the silicone once the mould is completed. It's not entirely necessary, as silicone rarely sticks to anything other than itself, but it doesn't hurt to have this as an extra precautionary measure, for just in case. In a brush-up mould such as this, the print coat is the first covering of silicone that's applied in several thin layers to the item that is to be duplicated. It's here where we capture the form and all those lovely surface details. Ultimately, this is the surface that your casting resin will come into contact with and subsequently reproduce, so it's absolutely imperative that you apply this coating properly, avoiding the entrapment of any air bubbles as you go along. For this particular mask, and for purity's sake only, I'm aiming not just to capture Friedlander's sculpt, but also all of his moulding and casting imperfections that are in evidence all over this piece, as I wish to accurately reflect his original 1976 work. I'm careful to brush the silicone into and over every crevice and crease, paying particular attention to the eyes, the nose and the teeth within the mouth, as well as to follow all the contours of the beard and the furrows in the forehead accurately. While this is a fairly straightforward application, it is a vital one as it sets the stage for the rest of the project. Mess this up now and it's game over, man, it's game over! If the print coat serves to capture the form and the detail of the mask, the butter-up coat's job is to bulk out the mould so that we don't have large voids or undercuts that'll trap the mould and the casting inside the support shell that we'll fabricate later on. Thymex is the magic ingredient here. It's a thickening agent that's added to silicone to give it that buttery consistency that we'll need for this pass. Once mixed up, I begin to bulk out the areas around the all-important features such as the eyes, the nose and the mouth. Notice how I'm carefully spatulating the material on with the tongue depressor here. This is to push it into position and to displace any trapped air pockets within. I do the same in and around the clay undercuts as well. These initial passes are all done in small batches until I'm confident that I've successfully captured all the important areas, but from there on out though, it's a free-for-all, laying up greater quantities to rapidly build up the form. Just as a quick aside here, over the years I've seen a lot of moulds made where the silicone is left looking like a topographical map of the Himalayas, just as you see here, and to me that is a massive no-no. Any mould maker worth their salt would never leave a mould in such a terrible and unsightly state as this, because not only is it an absolute assault on the eyeballs, but it can also cause misregistration issues between the mould and the support shell itself. Without question, this will deform your cast, which is something you definitely do not want. Now, while I'm very careful to try and avoid leaving peaks and troughs at this stage myself, they are to a certain degree inevitable. In a short while I'll show you a nifty little trick that will help with this. Now it does surprise me that very few people seem to know this, or if they do, they certainly aren't talking about it, which is a real shame. Stick around for chapter 5 and all will be revealed. This set of scales can go down to divisions of grams, so that's what I want to concentrate on, and I'll show you how to properly mix your silicone. So I think I'm going to go for 250 grams of silicone. So just let me get that out. And I'm going to switch this on. It's already on grams. I'm going to zero it again just to be on the safe side. And it is at 0. So at 250 grams of silicone, I need to put in 7.5 grams of this at my 3% ratio. Not going to put that in first, I'm actually going to put in my thickener first. So let me just pour out 250 grams of silicone. So I tell you, it's a lot easier when you have a decent set of scales. You know, you have far more precision. So I want 250 grams. Okay, so that's 254. Bit of housekeeping. Just want to clean this up. I don't want gack and goop all over my nozzle here. So put the lid on. So there's 254 grams, which means at 3% catalyst I need 7.62 grams of catalyst. But I don't need that just yet. I'm going to go and put in some Thixo, which is the thickening agent. Alright, just move the scales out of the way, I don't need those. So, what I want to do now is put some Thixo in, which is the thickening agent. And I'm going to do this by eye. Let me just move the silicone out of the way. Press for space here. So, I'm going to do this purely by eye. So I'm going to take some drops out of here. And I'm going to drop, say, 7 in to start with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's probably nowhere near enough. But let's have a look. So I want to gently mix this in. I'm going to try not to introduce lots and lots of air bubbles, but it's inevitable, it's going to happen. But let's just have a look. I mean, I can feel the Thixo already taking its effect here. And yeah, it's kind of runny. I don't want it to run, I want it to pretty much hold its form. So let's just get into the edges here. Really mix that in. But I do think I'm going to need some more Thixo in there to thicken that up. That is just a bit too much in terms of its runniness. See, I really want it to be able to stick to the side and not run back so much. So what I'm going to do is I'll add in a couple more drops, and I say a couple more. It might be maybe not 7, but let's try 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's always important to try and mix this stuff thoroughly, so you've got to scrape the sides in your recycled Costa coffee cup. You know, everything for the environment. So make sure everything is totally mixed in, which is why I'm scraping the sides and also the bottom as well. But to get past all that, because you will have problems with it anyway, you then decant this into a secondary cup. So let's see how this is looking. It's looking a bit runny. I mean, I don't want it too thick. I mean, I'm not battering a cake, but essentially that's what the process is like anyway. But I think just a few more. In fact, I may do 5 more drops. So again, it's by eye. There's no rhyme or reason to this. There's no special formula really. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a little bit extra, but I am purely doing this by eye. You know, you'll just get a gut feeling as to what you need to do and what you need. So here we are again, mixing into the sides. I can feel it already resisting now. So I think, yeah, because the mixing stick here I have is bending somewhat under the viscosity, and I think, yeah, that's pretty much where I want it. So let's just continue to mix that in, scraping up the sides, round and round and round, making sure to get to the bottom. Yeah, I can feel my tongue depressor here already bending and straining under the thickness of this stuff. So I think what we're going to do now, bring the scales back, and bearing in mind this is 250 grams, I need 7.62 or thereabouts grams of the catalyst. But let me just clean off my mixing stick. Yep. There we go. Put that down there and bring the scales back in. So, switch it on. Just going to zero it out or tear it out. And now I want to put in 3% of this volume, or this weight I should say, because we are doing it by weight. 3%, which is 7.62 grams of this. This is the catalyst. Now you'll notice that this catalyst is a red colour and this is a white colour. That is a great indicator to tell you how well you've mixed your stuff up. What you don't want to do is have streaks of pale colour in here. So if you've got white streaks or very light pink streaks, you know you haven't mixed it up properly, and that will cause inhibition for it to cure. So you may end up ruining your mould when you know, if you go ahead with that. But let me just demonstrate that anyway. So right, that's zeroed out. What am I doing? I want 7.62. I've never had this level of accuracy before. I mean, I've had these scales for years, but I couldn't find them. So here we go. I want to put in 7.62 grams. So already it's registering, which on the other set of scales I would never have got. So at a half a gram. 8. That's just over 1 gram there. Yeah, that's close enough. 7.6. Right. Pull that back, we can get rid of the scales. And now I need to make sure this is all thoroughly mixed.
I mean, I've got a 20-minute working window on this before it cures and goes off, or starts to go off. So you don't have to be too quick, because again, we don't really want to introduce lots of air bubbles into this, but that is going to be inevitable anyway. Scraping this up, so look, if you see that, you can see there's all kinds of uncured or untreated silicone in here, and that's what we don't want. So don't want this white and don't want this pink, we want this all one uniform colour. So again, scraping at the sides, going right down to the bottom, trying to get to the silicone that's right in at the bottom there. But I will decant this into another mixing jug. It just makes things easier, because getting down to the bottom is always difficult. I mean, I can try scraping, but it's never going to be that successful. So again, up to the sides, round and around, and I think that's as good a time as any to decant this into here. Don't know if you can see that, but look, down in there is unmixed silicone that has no catalyst in it whatsoever, so that's why I'm putting it into a second pot, just to catch all that. See, look, there it is there, look. This here is pretty much pure, well, nearly pure silicone without catalyst. So, yeah, that would do. New mixing stick, and thoroughly mix. Making sure to get into the sides, around to the bottom again. It's always important. Get as much of that mixed together as possible. I mean, you just do not want to see streaks in this, because that will result in disaster for your mould. You do not want uncured silicone sitting in your mould, because that will just make your day awful.
I begin with a large quantity of thickened silicone, and the first part of the trick is to apply it with a brush, and just enough pressure to fill the divots with material. The aim here is not to try and create new topographical features. Think of Bob Ross and his hair and some air brush technique. Understandably, you will get some new peaks to start with, but you can smooth these out as you progress. It's actually quite an easy task to perform this, and really does make for a more streamlined and professional looking mould. Once full coverage has been attained, I simply go over and rework the surface, constantly smoothing everything out as the silicone begins to gel. When it starts to pull on the brush, that's the sign that'll let you know that it's time to stop for a moment and leave the silicone to do its thing. Now, depending on the weather conditions outside and the temperature levels in your workplace, you can come back to it in about 10 to 15 minutes and start with phase 2 of the process. And here's the mysterious ingredient that no one seems to talk about for some reason. Common or garden isopropanol alcohol. The concentration doesn't really matter, just use whatever you can get a hold of. To begin with, I decant some of the IPA into a dish, and with a brush, I start to gently wash over the mould in long, continuous strokes, as this starts the softening process off. Once it became clear that this was starting to have an effect, and I could see that the silicone was beginning to relax, I could now take matters into my own hands, quite literally as it happened. Really, I should be wearing some gloves for this part, so really this is a case of do as I say rather than do as I do. Anyway, with a liberal amount of IPA in my hands, I can begin to tenderly massage the surface of the mould and make a start on vanquishing any of those egregious features. It'll never be perfect, but in time the mould will start to soften and shine, which is just what we want to be seeing. Low light, scented candles, and romantic music are entirely optional at this juncture. Just do what you feel is necessary to get the job done. As the end of this side of the project starts to draw to a close, The first step at this point was to remove the clay retaining walls and make a start on trimming the excess silicone flashing from around the mould with a sharp scalpel. Given what I'm shortly to do with yet more silicone, trimming all this was probably quite unnecessary, but the perfectionist in me loathes untidiness, and so off it came. While you weren't looking, I poured some silicone into a length of aluminium channel. This will become the keys that'll lock this mould into its support shell later on. Having cut this into shorter lengths, I whipped up a small batch of silicone and used that as an adhesive to permanently fix these strips into place. Dresser's pins were then used to hold the newly formed keys into position until they were fully set. I then rebuilt the retaining wall, this time slightly wider and taller, in readiness for the final silicone pour. Now you can see why my earlier trimming pass was probably unnecessary. This new pour, however, not only creates a larger flange for my mould, but also helps to lock the bottom end of the keys into position and generally makes them look much tidier, as they trail off and blend into the rest of the mould in a rather appealing and satisfying way. And that was it for the silicone. As I prepared for this project, I continuously flip-flopped over whether I should make the support shell as a single element or a two-piece part, right up until this point actually. As you can see, I decided to make things a little more complicated for myself by having the shell split into two, hence this clay dividing wall. But at least in doing this, I was guaranteed that the entire mould could be separated into its constituent parts, making the removal of any cast later on a trivial action. The addition of papered keys also ensured that the two shell halves could only ever be seated into one position, negating any alignment issues that had caused mould distortion further down the line. Sonite paste wax was liberally applied to the acrylic base and the silicone just to make the separation easier. However, for the delicate clay divider, I employed spray wax for the simple reason that it avoided me physically touching it and potentially knocking it off, as it's only tenuously stuck on there. With this completed, it was now time for the final task of this side of the project. Plastipaste 2x Smooth On is a product that I've never actually used before, but having worked with other 2-part fibre-filled resin systems previously, I was feeling rather confident at this juncture. This, however, would later come to bite me in the arse. The mix this time around is by volume rather than weight, at a ratio of 2 parts paste to 1 part liquid. You simply dispense the parts into a larger container and whip them together. And this was the point at which I knew I'd messed up. You see, in all the commotion of me composing my shots and gathering all my footage, I'd completely forgotten that the quantity shown here was actually for the entire shell. Unfortunately, at this point, I was only working on the first half. Now, having dispensed everything into such a small bucket, the exothermic reaction was accelerated, heating the container to a point where I could barely hold onto it any longer. Inside this now boiling crucible, the material was beginning to gel and solidify, so it was a race against time as I frantically applied it before the whole thing was too far gone. Normally this material has a working time of about 10 minutes, but I had just a fraction of that due to my stupid error. In the end, I did actually waste most of it, so I had to come back with further passes and brush the paste on in far smaller quantities than before. Oh well, this is what happens when you lose focus. Stupid mistakes are made. Anyway, once the first half of the shell had cured, I removed the clay former to reveal the new parting wall, which I cleaned out with some epoxy to fill in the voids produced by the fact that I couldn't press the paste in too firmly into the original part. I then added some clay spacers to the keys that will come into their own later on when it's time to separate the two halves. Off camera I waxed everything up, making sure to thoroughly cover up the parting seam line, and then I repeated the process for the second side. This actually went on far better than the first, and for this pass I could do it at a more leisurely and controlled pace, which made for a far less stressful and antagonising process. Just as with the silicone, I used isopropyl or alcohol to neaten things up. At first I did this with a brush in broad strokes, and then with my gloved hands just for further refinement. Not only did this produce a more visually appealing surface to look at, but it also made the shell far safer to handle, in that the prickly, fine needle-like fibres that provide all the strength have been flattened down. Once cured, I used a surform to shape the parting line into a more manageable form prior to cracking the shell open.
Apologies, but I've already started cracking this open, but I stopped because I just wanted to show you something. In the cage, you may recall, I had some plasticine in there. That was basically so I could stick in my screwdriver and start to wedge this thing open like so. So it's a little key and a... oh, look at that. So, I mean, I still need to clean this up, but that's not bad at all. And pull the other side off, if I can, that is. Oh, the static. There you go. Yeah, I mean, this plastic base is okay. I mean, I prefer the results that you get with fiberglass. But yeah, that's it. Now what I've got to do is clean myself up.
The final touches were to trim the rest of the shell with a chisel head attachment on my oscillating tool and to cut out the receiver slots for the bolt holes. All that was left to do now was to open it up and see what I had.
Oh. It's off. There we go. It's coming out quite well. The interesting piece is going to be whether I can get it out of here. Just double check, that looked all good. Well, ladies and gents, wish me luck. There's a slight air bubble just there. Come on, let go. Here. Well, that to me looks like a success. Ta-da! I just remembered it's worth pointing this out. If you recall, when I clayed up this original mask right at the very beginning, I put in some clay right into here, all the way around, and then I did a second set ever so slightly inwards, and that created a little lip. Now that little lip is captured under here, okay, all the way around. Now the reason I did that, if that lip wasn't there, when I pour in the liquid resin into this and start sloshing it around as I would do, there's every chance that as I tip it, it could just pour out. This lip actually acts as a stop, so as I'm doing that, it'll all slosh forward and I'll see it gather up here and I'll know to stop, and then I can bring it round and do all this kind of business. That's all it was for, really.
With all the signs seemingly pointing to this mould being good, obviously the proof is in the pudding, so the objective now is to make an all-important first cast and see how that one fares. Only then will I truly know if all this has been a success or not. But that is for another time. Well, if you like what you've seen here today, why not consider subscribing? And while you're at it, hit that notification bell too, as that will really help things out around here. A comment and a like wouldn't go amiss either, so cheers for that. As always, it's been a real pleasure having your company here today. We really should do this more often. So until next time, stay safe and thanks for watching.